Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth, defense ship Liberty, and watched the biggest alien ship he had ever seen come closer to Earth. The thing was huge, like a floating city made of crystal and metal that sparkled in the sunlight. For 3 whole days, the aliens had been sending the same message over and over, again in broken English, that said, "Prepare for diplomatic integration protocols." Dr. Lisa Adams sat at her computer trying to figure out what the aliens really meant when they used certain words. She was Earth's best expert at understanding alien languages, and she did not like what she was hearing. She looked up at Admiral Morrison with worry in her eyes and said, "Jake, they keep using this word protocols, but in their language it means something between gently taking over and civilized conquest." The alien ship was so big it blocked out part of the sun when it moved between Earth and the bright star. Inside the ship, there were thousands of aliens getting ready to meet the humans for the first time. The aliens called themselves the Zephyrian Empire, and they had been traveling across the galaxy for thousands of years, meeting new species and adding them to their empire. Captain Roy Baker was getting ready to meet the aliens in the big meeting room on Space Station Alpha. He had been chosen to speak for all of humanity because he was good at talking to difficult people and staying calm under pressure. He wore his best military uniform with all his medals and ribbons because first impressions mattered even with aliens. The alien delegation arrived with great ceremony and lots of fancy decorations. Ambassador Vel Keth was their leader, and he was tall and thin with skin that was almost see-through, like looking at someone through frosted glass. He had 4 arms instead of 2, and he moved like he was floating instead of walking. Behind him came 12 other aliens who all looked exactly the same and moved in perfect timing like they were dancing to music only they could hear. Ambassador Vel Keth entered the meeting room, and his voice sounded like wind chimes when he spoke. He said, "Greetings, primitive species of the 3rd planet from your star. We come bearing the gift of civilization to your chaotic world. Your species shows promise, but your wild nature requires proper guidance from those who have achieved perfection." Captain Baker raised one eyebrow and asked, "What do you mean by chaotic nature?" He had been expecting the aliens to be more polite during their first meeting, but this alien seemed to think humans were like children who needed to be taught how to behave. Ambassador Vel Keth spread all 4 of his arms wide and said, "Indeed, your species is very chaotic. We have been watching your planet for many years, and we have seen your wars and your fights and how you waste your resources. We have seen how you cannot agree on simple things, and how you fight each other instead of working together. The Galactic Empire has successfully helped 47 different species using our proven methods. Every civilization that accepts our guidance experiences peace and happiness like they have never known before." Dr. Adams leaned forward in her chair and asked, "What happens to the species that refuse your help?" She had been studying the way the aliens talked, and something about their words made her nervous. They talked about helping other species, but they never talked about asking permission first. Ambassador Vel Keth looked confused, like someone had asked him why water was wet. He said, "Refuse our help, but why would any smart species refuse to become perfect? Our methods have never failed to work. When we help a species, all their wars stop forever. Crime disappears completely. Their art and music and literature become more beautiful than anything they ever created before. Why would anyone want to stay imperfect when they could become perfect?" Captain Baker looked at Admiral Morrison, who was standing near the back of the room. Both men had fought in wars, and they knew what it sounded like when someone offered you something that was too good to be true.
Captain Baker said, "Show us these methods you use to help other species." Ambassador Vel Keth smiled, and suddenly the room filled with pictures made of light that showed beautiful worlds where everything looked perfect.
Every person in the pictures looked happy and healthy and peaceful. The cities were clean and organized, and there was no trash or broken buildings anywhere. Everyone wore the same kind of clothes and walked at the same speed and even smiled the same way. The alien said, "These are some of the worlds we have helped to become perfect. Before we arrived, they were chaotic and violent like your world. Now they have achieved true happiness and peace. No one fights anymore because fighting is unnecessary. No one steals because everyone has exactly what they need. No one is sad because sadness serves no useful purpose." Dr. Adams whispered to the other humans that something was wrong with the pictures. She said, "Look at their faces carefully. They all look happy, but it is the same kind of happy. It is like someone painted the same smile on every person. There is no anger or sadness or surprise or excitement. They only have one expression, and it never changes." Admiral Morrison stepped forward and said, Ambassador Velketh, your methods sound very impressive, but we would like to know more details about how exactly you help species become perfect. We want to understand what changes you make and how long the process takes. The alien looked pleased that the humans were interested and said, of course you want to know more details. This shows that your species has wisdom even though you are still primitive. Our methods are based on thousands of years of experience helping other species. We start slowly and gently so that the species does not become frightened or confused. First, we establish guidance centers where our advisors can help your leaders make better decisions. Then we begin teaching your people better ways to think and behave. Finally, we help improve your biology so that future generations will be naturally more peaceful and intelligent. Captain Baker felt a cold feeling in his stomach when he heard the word biology. He asked, what do you mean by improving our biology? Exactly. Ambassador Velketh explained that many species have biological problems that make them violent or selfish or too curious about things that do not concern them. The Zephyrian Empire had learned how to fix these problems by changing the way people reproduced. They could make sure that children were born without the genes that caused violence or stubbornness or excessive independence. The room became very quiet as the humans realized what the alien was really offering. They were not offering to help humanity become better. They were offering to completely change what it meant to be human. They wanted to turn humans into something else entirely. Admiral Morrison said, we need time to think about your offer, Ambassador. This is a very big decision that affects our entire species. Ambassador Velketh nodded and said, of course you need time to consider such an important opportunity. We will give you one full cycle of your planet around your star to make your decision. However, I should tell you that no species has ever refused our help once they understood what we were offering. Every intelligent species eventually realizes that order is better than chaos and perfection is better than struggle. As the aliens prepared to leave, Captain Baker asked one more question. He said, Ambassador Velketh, I notice that your people seem very interested in our military ships and weapons. Why do you care about our weapons if your methods are so peaceful? The alien paused and looked thoughtful. He said, that is an interesting question, Human Baker. Your species claims to want peace, but you build very powerful weapons. You say you do not want war, but you prepare for war constantly. This seems contradictory and inefficient. Why do you maintain such aggressive capabilities if you truly desire peace? Admiral Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said, old habits, Ambassador Velketh. Just old habits that are hard to break. The next day, Ambassador Velketh returned to Space Station Alpha with more aliens and bigger machines that could show even more detailed pictures. The alien seemed excited to explain exactly how his empire helped other species become perfect. Captain Roy Baker and Dr. Lisa Adams sat down with Admiral Jake Morrison to hear what the aliens really wanted to do to humanity. Ambassador Velketh activated his machines, and the entire room filled with moving pictures that showed worlds so beautiful they almost hurt to look at. The cities were made of white stone and crystal with gardens everywhere, and rivers that ran perfectly clean through the centers of the towns. Every person in the pictures moved gracefully and seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were supposed to do. The alien pointed to the pictures with two of his forearms and said, these are worlds that have completed our integration process. Before we arrived, they were violent and chaotic like your Earth. Now they have achieved perfect harmony and their people live in complete happiness. Let me show you exactly how we accomplish this wonderful transformation. The pictures changed to show what looked like government buildings, but they were different from any government buildings the humans had ever seen. They were beautiful and peaceful, but there were aliens inside them watching everything that happened in the cities around them. Ambassador Velketh said the first phase of our help involves establishing administrative guidance centers in every major population area. Your current governments will remain in place because we do not want to cause unnecessary disruption. However, all important decisions must be reviewed and approved by our advisors to ensure that the choices your leaders make will result in the best possible outcomes for your people. Dr. Adams translated quietly for the other humans and whispered, this is a puppet government system. They want to control everything but make it look like human leaders are still in charge. The aliens will make all the real decisions, but they will let human politicians pretend they have power. Ambassador Velketh either did not hear her or chose to ignore what she said. He continued explaining his empire's methods, and the pictures changed again to show something that looked like schools or hospitals. The alien said Phase 2 of our assistance involves behavioral optimization programs for citizens who display antisocial tendencies. Some members of your species show behaviors that are harmful to society, such as excessive aggression, or too much individualism, or the desire to keep more resources than they need. These people will receive corrective therapy that will help them become happier and more cooperative members of society. Colonel Pete Hayes was sitting in the back of the room, and he muttered under his breath, "That sounds like brainwashing to me." He had fought in several wars, and he knew what it looked like when someone wanted to control how people thought and acted. The aliens were talking about therapy, but what they really meant was forcing people to change their personalities until they fit the pattern the Empire wanted. The alien continued with his presentation and seemed genuinely excited about what he was describing. He said Phase 3 is the most important part of our assistance program, and it involves genetic harmony initiatives. Your species currently reproduces in a random and chaotic manner that results in offspring with unpredictable characteristics. Some of your children are born with genetic tendencies toward violence or stubbornness or excessive curiosity about things that do not concern them. We will help you organize reproduction patterns so that future generations will be naturally more peaceful and cooperative and satisfied with their assigned roles in society. The room became completely silent as the humans realized what the alien was really saying. He was talking about controlling who could have children and what kind of children they would be allowed to have. He wanted to breed humans like farm animals to make sure that future generations would be easier to control. Admiral Morrison stood up slowly and said, "Ambassador Velketh, what you are describing would eliminate everything that makes us human. You want to change our governments and our thoughts and even our children. After your process is complete, we would not be the same species anymore." Ambassador Velketh spread all forearms wide, and his face showed what might have been joy or excitement. He said, "Exactly, Admiral Morrison, you understand perfectly. You will transcend your crude biological limitations and become something far superior to what you are now. Look at what happened to the Cordon species." A new set of pictures appeared showing tall, graceful beings who moved in perfect coordination, like they were all part of the same dance. Every Cordon in the pictures wore the same style of clothing and had the same peaceful expression on their face. They worked together on projects that looked like art or music, but everything they created followed the same patterns and used the same colors and shapes, Ambassador Velketh said once. The Cordon were warlike and chaotic, very much like your species. They fought constant battles and wasted enormous amounts of energy on pointless conflicts. Now they create the most beautiful poetry in 17 different languages, and their music brings tears of joy to anyone who hears it. They have achieved perfect harmony with themselves and with the universe. Dr. Adams leaned forward and asked what happened to their old culture. The alien looked confused by the question and said their old culture was primitive and inefficient and full of unnecessary suffering. Why would anyone want to preserve inferior ways of living when perfection is available? The old Cordon culture involved war and competition and individual expression that often led to conflict. Now they have transcended such crude behaviors and focus on creating beauty and truth. Captain Baker asked to see examples of this poetry and music that the Cordon created. Ambassador Velketh was happy to show them, and the room filled with sounds and words that were technically perfect and mathematically beautiful. Every poem followed identical meter and rhythm patterns. Every song used the same harmonic progressions and never deviated from established formulas. The art was flawless, but it had no soul or passion or surprise. Dr. Adams whispered to the other humans that the Cordon creations were like looking at pictures of food instead of eating real food. They looked perfect, but they did not satisfy any real hunger. She said there is no rebellion or anger or wild joy in anything they make. It is all safe and predictable and empty. Ambassador Velketh noticed that the humans did not seem impressed by the Cordon achievements. He said, "Perhaps your species needs time to develop appreciation for true artistic perfection. Your current forms of expression are crude and emotional and often disturbing. Once you have been properly guided, you will understand why controlled creativity produces superior results." Captain Baker stood up and said, "We need time to discuss your offer with our people. This decision affects every human being on Earth, and we cannot make it quickly." The alien nodded and said, "Of course you require time for deliberation. We understand that primitive species often need extended periods to process complex concepts. However, I should mention that refusal of our protocols has never occurred in the history of our empire. No rational species has ever chosen chaos and suffering over order and happiness. Every intelligent civilization eventually recognizes that our way is the only logical path forward. Ambassador Velketh paused near the door as his delegation prepared to leave the meeting room. He turned back to the humans and said, "I'm curious about something, Admiral Morrison. Your military vessels are heavily armed for a species that claims to desire peace. Your weapons are quite sophisticated, and your soldiers appear to be well trained for combat. Why do you maintain such aggressive capabilities if your species truly wants to avoid violence?" Admiral Morrison looked directly at the alien and smiled, but his eyes remained cold and dangerous. He said, "Old habits, Ambassador. Just old habits that are sometimes very hard to break." After the aliens left, the humans sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Dr. Adams said, "They are offering us paradise, but the price is everything that makes us human." Captain Baker nodded and said, "They want to turn us into perfect slaves who think we are free." Colonel Hayes added that every dictator in history started by promising to make life better for everyone, Admiral. Morrison stood up and looked out the window at Earth, hanging beautiful and blue in the darkness of space. He said, "We need to call an emergency meeting of the World Council. Humanity has a choice to make, and we need to make it together." The emergency meeting of the United Earth Council lasted for 18 hours without any breaks. President Helen Carter sat at the head of the huge table in the council chamber, while representatives from every nation on Earth argued about what humanity should do. The debate was loud and angry, and sometimes people shouted at each other, but that was exactly what made it. Senator Dan Phillips from North America stood up and said, "They are offering us paradise with no more wars and no more crime and no more suffering. How can we possibly turn down a chance for our children to live in perfect peace? Think about all the problems we could solve if we accepted their help. No more hunger or disease or poverty anywhere on Earth." General Amy Rodriguez slammed her hand on the table and said, "The cost is our souls, Senator Phillips. They want to turn us into robots that look human, but think and act exactly the way they tell us to. We would not be people anymore. We would be pets that they keep because we amuse them. I would rather die fighting than live as a slave, even a comfortable slave." Dr. Lisa Adams activated the big screen at the front of the room and showed the recording she had made of Ambassador Velketh explaining the Zephyrian protocols. She said, "I have been studying their language and their behavior patterns for days now, and I can tell you exactly what they mean when they use certain words. When they say guidance, they mean control. When they say optimization, they mean brainwashing. When they say harmony, they mean conformity. They are not offering to help us become better humans. They are offering to help us stop being human entirely." The screen showed pictures of the Cordon species that the aliens had used as an example of successful integration. Dr. Adams pointed to the faces of the Cordon people and said, "Look at their expressions carefully. Every single one of them has exactly the same peaceful smile. There is no anger or sadness or excitement or surprise. They have been turned into biological machines that create beautiful art, according to mathematical formulas. Their poetry is technically perfect, but it has no heart. Their music follows all the rules, but it has no soul." Admiral Jake Morrison stood up and activated another screen that showed Earth's military forces spread across the planet and in space stations around the solar system. He said, "Our preliminary analysis suggests that we could mount a defense against the Zephyrian Empire, but their technology is clearly superior to ours. They have successfully absorbed nearly 5,000 different species across the galaxy. Most of those species probably had weapons and armies just like we do." Captain Roy Baker surprised everyone by speaking with more emotion than anyone had ever heard from him before.
He said, "Then we fight anyway, Admiral Morrison."
"I have read the history books and I know how every invasion starts. First, they come with promises of peace and prosperity. They offer to solve all your problems and make your life better. They tell you that resistance is futile and that smart people always choose to cooperate. Then when you let them in, they slowly take away everything that makes you who you are until there is nothing left but an empty shell that obeys orders." President Carter looked around the room at the faces of the people who represented all of humanity. She said, "Does anyone see any other options besides surrender or war? There has to be something else we can do." Dr. Adams raised her hand and said, "Actually, there might be one possibility. I have been analyzing the way the Zephyrians think and speak, and I believe they have a fundamental weakness that we might be able to exploit. Their entire civilization is based on the idea that rational beings will always choose order over chaos and safety over freedom. They literally cannot understand why anyone would voluntarily choose to struggle when they could choose comfort instead." General Rodriguez asked, What does that mean exactly? Dr. Adams explained that the Zephyrian Empire had probably never encountered a species that said no and meant it. Every other species had eventually agreed to accept the protocols either immediately or after seeing demonstrations of Zephyrian power. The aliens had built their entire strategy around the assumption that intelligent beings would always make what they considered to be logical choices. Colonel Pete Hayes leaned forward and said, "Are you suggesting that we could shock them by being completely unreasonable?" Dr. Adams nodded and said, "I am suggesting that we show them exactly what human chaos looks like when we are properly motivated. The Zephyrians think that disorder is a sign of primitive thinking, but what if we could prove that our chaos is actually a source of strength?" Senator Phillips shook his head and said, "That sounds incredibly dangerous. We would be risking the survival of our entire species on the hope that we can confuse some aliens. What if they decide to just destroy us instead of trying to integrate us peacefully?" Captain Baker smiled grimly and said, "Senator, they are already planning to destroy us. They want to destroy everything that makes us human and replace it with their idea of perfection. The only difference is whether we die as ourselves or live as something else wearing our faces." President Carter called for order as the arguments got louder and more heated. She said, "We need to vote on this decision, but first I want to hear from everyone who wants to speak. For the next 6 hours, representatives from every continent and every major city shared their thoughts about what humanity should. Some spoke about the wars and suffering that could end if they accepted the alien offer. Others talked about the great achievements of human civilization that would be lost forever under Zephyrian control. Scientists argued about whether human creativity could survive optimization. Soldiers debated whether Earth's military forces could hold out long enough to find a weakness in alien technology. Dr. Adams presented more analysis of Zephyrian psychology and explained that their society had been stable and peaceful for thousands of years precisely because they had eliminated unpredictability from their lives. They controlled reproduction to prevent unwanted personality traits. They guided education to eliminate dangerous ideas. They managed art and literature to ensure that nothing disturbing or chaotic could influence their people. Admiral Morrison said, "That sounds like a perfect recipe for stagnation. A society that never changes or grows or takes risks is a society that is already dead, even if the people in it are still breathing. The Zephyrians have achieved perfect order by giving up everything that makes life worth living." As the debate continued, it became clear that most of the council members were leaning toward resistance even though they knew the odds were against them. Representatives who had never agreed on anything before found themselves united in their refusal to surrender humanity's freedom for the promise of alien-managed peace. Finally, President Carter called for the vote. She said, "All those in favor of accepting the Zephyrian protocols, please raise your hands." Only 3 people out of nearly 200 raised their hands. She said, "All those in favor of rejecting the protocols and preparing for whatever consequences follow, please raise your hands." The rest of the room erupted in raised hands and voices shouting their defiance. The vote was not even close. Humanity had chosen to remain human no matter what the cost might be. President Carter stood up and said, "Then it is decided. We will send our answer to Ambassador Velketh in a way that leaves no doubt about our position. Admiral Morrison, please prepare our forces for whatever comes next. Dr. Adams, please prepare a response that will make our feelings perfectly clear to our alien visitors." As the council members filed out of the chamber, many of them looked scared, but none of them looked like they regretted their choice. Captain Baker stayed behind and said to President Carter, "I hope we are making the right decision." She replied, "Captain, I do not know if this is the right decision, but I know it is the human decision, and that will have to be enough." Humanity's response to the Zephyrian Empire did not come through normal diplomatic channels or formal written statements. Instead, it came at exactly 12 noon Earth time, when every radio station and television network and internet connection on the planet broadcast the same message at the same moment. The signal was so strong that it reached every Zephyrian ship, monitoring human communications and probably every alien device within 100 light years of Earth. Captain Roy Baker stood in front of the camera wearing his full military dress uniform with every medal and ribbon he had ever earned. Behind him stood the flags of every nation on Earth and the newly created flag of the United Human Defense Force. He looked directly into the camera, with cold eyes that had seen too many battles, and spoke 4 words that would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. Baker said, "Go to hell, aliens," and then he stepped aside to let the real message begin. What followed was a 3-minute compilation of human history that no diplomatic academy would ever have approved, and no civilized species would ever have broadcast to represent their culture. It was not the sanitized, peaceful version of humanity that politicians usually preferred, but the raw, unvarnished truth about what humans were really like when someone threatened their freedom. The video showed Viking longships sailing directly into ocean storms while warriors sang death songs. It showed medieval knights charging impossible odds against overwhelming enemy forces because honor mattered more than survival. It showed revolutionaries facing muskets and cannons with nothing but determination and the belief that freedom was worth dying for. It showed soldiers storming beaches under withering machine gun fire because someone had to stop the advance of tyranny. The compilation showed protests and riots and rebellions throughout human history. It showed people who chose to fight losing battles rather than accept comfortable slavery. It showed artists who painted forbidden pictures, and writers who wrote dangerous books, and musicians who played music that made people think uncomfortable thoughts. It showed humans at their most chaotic and unpredictable and gloriously free. The final image was Admiral Jake Morrison standing on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Liberty, surrounded by military officers from every nation on the planet. Morrison looked into the camera and said, "Ambassador Velketh, humanity respectfully declines your kind offer of protocols. If you want Earth, you are welcome to come and take it, but we will not make it easy for you." The Zephyrian response came within hours, and it was almost comical in how confused and bewildered Ambassador Velketh sounded. The alien appeared on screens across Earth, looking frantically at data tablets, while other Zephyrians moved around behind him in obvious distress. Velketh said this response is completely unprecedented and violates all known patterns of rational behavior. Our analysts believe that your species is experiencing some form of mass psychological breakdown that requires immediate therapeutic intervention. Dr. Lisa Adams watched the alien broadcast from the communication center on Space Station Alpha, and she could not help laughing out loud. She said to the other technicians, "They think we have gone insane. The idea that a species would choose freedom over security is so foreign to them that they literally cannot process it as a rational decision." Colonel Pete Hayes asked her, "Are we insane, though?" Adams thought about it for a moment and said, "Probably. But we are our kind of insane, and that makes all the difference. The Zephyrians have been sane and rational and perfectly ordered for thousands of years, and look what it got them. They turned themselves into biological robots that cannot understand why anyone would want to be different." The Zephyrian fleet began moving into what their tactical manuals called standard pacification formation. Their ships were massive and beautiful, and designed to overwhelm primitive species with displays of technological superiority rather than actual destructive capability. In 5,000 previous encounters, this approach had never failed because no species had ever been foolish enough to fight against such overwhelming odds. What the aliens encountered instead was the most chaotic, unpredictable, and vicious defense in the recorded history of galactic warfare. Human ships did not follow any recognizable battle formation or tactical doctrine. They attacked from impossible angles using strategies that violated every principle of civilized military engagement. When Earth fighters were outnumbered, they did not retreat or surrender, but instead found creative ways to cause maximum damage before they were destroyed. The Earth defense ship Defiance was commanded by Captain Pete Morrison, who was Colonel Hayes' younger brother and every bit as stubborn as his sibling. When 6 Zephyrian cruisers surrounded his ship and demanded surrender, Morrison responded by ramming the Defiance directly into the largest alien vessel while broadcasting old blues music at maximum volume through every speaker on his ship. The collision destroyed both vessels, but it also sent a clear message that humans would rather die fighting than live as prisoners. The lunar defense grid had been built to protect Earth from asteroids and space debris, but Dr. Adams had reprogrammed it to fire on the Zephyrian ships in patterns that spelled out profanity in 17 different human languages. The aliens were so shocked by this use of military hardware for crude communication that several of their ships actually stopped attacking and just watched the display in amazement. Governor Sarah Wilson of Mars Colony made the decision that shocked even other humans when she evacuated all civilians from the planet. and then turned the entire terraforming infrastructure into the largest improvised explosive device in human history. When Zephyrian ships moved in to occupy the planet, Wilson detonated every fusion reactor and atmospheric processor, simultaneously creating a blast that could be seen from Earth with the naked eye. But it was Dr. Lisa Adams who delivered the most devastating blow to Zephyrian morale when she managed to hack into their communication networks and began broadcasting human cultural artifacts directly to their ships. She sent them punk rock music and abstract art and contradictory philosophical arguments and the complete recorded works of every human comedian who had ever made fun of authority figures. The effect on the hyper-ordered Zephyrian minds was immediate and catastrophic. Crews who had never experienced discord or confusion suddenly found themselves exposed to ideas that made no logical sense, but somehow felt important. Soldiers who had never questioned orders started asking why they were fighting against people who just wanted to be left alone. Officers who had spent their entire lives following protocols discovered that some problems could not be solved by referring to instruction manuals. Captain Baker received reports from human ships scattered across the solar system, and every report told the same story. The aliens were not losing because their technology was inferior, but because they could not adapt to the complete unpredictability of human tactics. They had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of civilized warfare against rational opponents, but humans were neither civilized nor rational when their survival was at stake. The Zephyrian Empire had built their military doctrine around the assumption that battles would follow certain patterns and that enemies would behave in logical ways. Human forces ignored every rule and precedent and simply did whatever seemed most likely to hurt the aliens regardless of whether it made strategic sense. The result was chaos on a scale that the Zephyrian command structure was completely unprepared to handle. Ambassador Velketh sent increasingly desperate messages to Earth asking for explanations of human behavior that violated every principle of rational decision-making. He could not understand why humans would destroy their own colonies, rather than let them be peacefully occupied. He could not comprehend why human soldiers would sacrifice themselves for no apparent strategic gain. He especially could not process why humans seemed to be enjoying the fight even though they were clearly outmatched. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the Liberty watching Zephyrian ships beginning to pull back from their attack formations, and he smiled for the first time since the crisis began. He said to his communications officer, "Send a message to all human forces. Tell them that the aliens are starting to understand what it means to fight people who have nothing left to lose except their freedom." The Zephyrian withdrawal from Earth was not a strategic retreat or a tactical repositioning, but a complete rout that left abandoned equipment floating in space around the solar system. Ambassador Velketh's final transmission to Earth was barely coherent, and his voice shook with something that might have been fear or confusion or both. He said this species deliberately chooses inefficiency over optimization. They create beauty from ugliness and chaos from order. They make war into art and art into war. They are impossible to understand or predict or control. After the aliens fled, Dr. Lisa Adams spent weeks going through the data files they had left behind in their hurry to escape. The personal logs of Ambassador Velketh made for fascinating reading, because they showed exactly how the human response had affected the alien mind. His entries revealed a being who had never encountered genuine resistance to what he considered logical and beneficial proposals. The first entry was dated just after initial contact, and Velketh had written that first contact proceeded according to all established protocols. The species shows typical pre-integration chaotic patterns, but nothing that suggests they will be difficult to guide toward proper behavior. Expected integration time is 2 standard cycles with minimal resistance anticipated. By the 5th day, his tone had changed completely. The entry read, "Species has rejected protocols without providing logical reasons for refusal. This has never occurred in recorded galactic history. Requesting consultation with High Command. Psychological specialists to determine appropriate response to unprecedented situation." After 2 weeks of fighting, the ambassador's log showed increasing desperation and confusion. He wrote, "The humans are actively fighting against superior technology, while knowing they cannot achieve victory through conventional means. Military analysis suggests they cannot win, yet they continue fighting with increasing intensity. Our casualties are mounting not from superior weapons but from unpredictable tactics that violate all principles of rational warfare. The entry that Dr. Adams found most interesting was written during the height of the human resistance. Velketh had recorded human-designated Captain Morrison destroyed an entire squadron of our ships, while broadcasting what their linguists classify as death metal music. Our crew efficiency has decreased by 47% since exposure to human cultural artifacts. 3 vessels have requested emergency rotation due to what medical personnel are calling cultural contamination syndrome. The final entries showed an alien mind that had been completely shattered by contact with human chaos. Velketh wrote, "Evacuation has been approved by High Command after consultation with the Imperial Council. Human chaos appears to be spreading to our own forces through unknown mechanisms. Several crew members have begun asking questions about the purpose of our mission and the value of perfect order. This species must be quarantined and studied from a safe distance to prevent further contamination of Imperial personnel." 6 months after the Zephyrian retreat, Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the same meeting room where humanity had first been offered the velvet chains of galactic civilization. This time he was addressing representatives from 43 different alien species who had somehow learned about Earth's successful resistance to the Empire. The chamber was crowded with beings of every size and shape imaginable, and all of them wanted to know how a primitive species had defeated the most powerful force in the galaxy. Morrison gestured toward the viewport where a mixed fleet of human and alien ships could be seen preparing for patrol duty. He said the Galactic Empire built their power on one simple assumption, that rational beings will always choose order over freedom and safety over risk and perfection over possibility. They never considered that some species might prefer beautiful chaos to perfect emptiness, and that this preference might actually make them stronger rather than weaker. Captain Roy Baker had been promoted to admiral after the war, and he stepped forward to address the alien delegates. He said every species represented in this room made the same decision that humanity made. You decided that being imperfect and free was better than being perfect and enslaved. The Zephyrians called us impossible and chaotic and irrational, and they were absolutely right about all of those things. A delegate from the Cordon species stood up to speak, and her voice carried emotions that no Cordon had expressed for thousands of years. She said we had forgotten what it felt like to be angry or sad or excited about the unknown. Under Zephyrian guidance, we created beautiful art according to mathematical formulas, but we never created anything that surprised us or made us laugh or broke our hearts. When we heard about your resistance, it reminded us of what we had lost. Dr. Lisa Adams activated a holographic display that showed the growing alliance of free species that had formed around Earth as a nucleus. She said we are not trying to build another empire or impose our way of life on anyone else. We are simply offering what the Zephyrians never offered, which is the right to choose your own path, even if that path leads to mistakes and suffering and beautiful disasters. An alien who looked like a cross between a lizard and a bird raised one clawed hand and asked what happens when the Zephyrian Empire decides to return in greater force. They have thousands of worlds and millions of ships, and they will not tolerate the existence of free species that might inspire rebellion in their controlled populations. Admiral Morrison smiled the same cold smile he had shown Ambassador Velketh during their first meeting. He said, "Then we will show them again what happens when you threaten people who have chosen to remain free. The difference is that this time we will not be fighting alone." President Helen Carter had been elected as the first leader of the new Terran Alliance, and she stood to address the assembled delegates. She said, "We cannot promise you safety or comfort or easy lives. What we can promise is that you will face whatever comes as yourselves, rather than as pale copies of someone else's idea of perfection. You will make your own mistakes and celebrate your own victories and create art that surprises even you." The chamber erupted in sounds that would have horrified any Zephyrian observer. There was cheering and arguing and laughter and heated debates in dozens of different languages. Some delegates were clearly afraid of what they were choosing, while others seemed excited by the possibility of uncertainty. It was loud and chaotic and completely unpredictable. Dr. Adams looked around the room and said this is exactly what the Zephyrians could never understand. They thought chaos was a sign of weakness, but really it is a sign of life. Perfect order is just another word for death, and we choose to remain gloriously and messily alive outside the space station. The combined fleet of the Terran Alliance prepared for patrol duty along the borders of free space. Human jazz music mixed with Cordon war chants and Zalari philosophical debates and the sound systems of a dozen different species trying to find harmony and discord. It was loud and chaotic and absolutely magnificent. The ships were painted in every color imaginable, and flew in formations that followed no military manual ever written. Some vessels were designed for speed while others prioritized firepower, and still others seemed to exist mainly to look beautiful while they flew through space. It was completely inefficient by Zephyrian standards and completely perfect by the standards of people who had chosen freedom over optimization. Captain Baker stood on the bridge of his new flagship and watched the mixed fleet move out toward the edge of the solar system. He said to his communications officer, "Send a message to any Zephyrian forces that might be listening. Tell them that the universe is vast and ancient and orderly, and thank God someone finally brought some chaos to the party. The galaxy would never be the same because somewhere in a small corner of space, a species of impossible beings had chosen to remain themselves rather than become someone else's idea of perfect. The Terran alliance grew stronger every day as more species chose beautiful chaos over sterile order, and the sound of their combined voices singing songs of freedom could be heard across the stars.